Hi and then welcome to my book corner. Today we're reviewing Scythe Sparrow, which came out on February the 11th of this year. This is a dark romance book and is the third and final entry in the Ruinous Love Trilogy. The series began with Butcher and Blackbird, a book that I thought was a great deal of fun, and then was followed up by the slightly disappointing, in my opinion, Leather and Lark. So the question is, does this series end strong? As always, we shall take a look at the story, characters, world building and presentation before I give my final thoughts at the end of the video, so let's just dive straight in. Once again, we have a dual POV being told here, first off from the point of view of Rose, and secondly from the third and final of the Kane siblings, Fionn Kane. Brain went completely blank there for a second. And the story begins in the circus where Rose works, and Rose has a couple of interesting things which we'll touch on more in the character section, but the key thing here is she does two main things within the circus. First off, she is a stunt motorcycle rider, and secondly, she reads tarot for people. And while she's reading tarot, sometimes she sees signs of young women who are afraid or possibly abused, and she seeks to use the reading as a way to potentially encourage them to escape these abusive relationships. If, however, she realizes from her reading of the person that they may not be necessarily amenable to these changes, then she'll sometimes take matters into her own hands and go and try and rectify the situation. And it is hinted at that this has happened in multiple different locations as the circus has travelled. On this occasion, however, she bites off more than she can chew and ends up badly injured after attacking the spouse of one of her clients, and breaks into the surgery that belongs to Fionn Kane whilst trying to find some medication to dull the pain. And the story that unfolds from here is twofold. First off, you have the romance angle as Fionn takes Rose in while she's recovering, and they begin to develop this affection for each other. And their sort of refusal to really get involved, it's actually quite sweet in a way, as they both kind of have reasons to not want to be engaged in a proper relationship, or at least that's what they believe. And then you have the flip side, the sort of jeopardy side of the person survived the attack from Rose and it's only relatively recent, and you have this constant tension of whether they get found out. Overall, this is perhaps the sweetest of the three books in the series. I actually really do like the romance in this, as this feels more like romance and less like lust, although there is plenty of that in here too. I actually really enjoy this. It's not as fun as Butcher and Blackbird, but it's a lot sweeter than that, and I kind of appreciate that as the final point of this trilogy. On to characters then. I'm going to touch on side characters first. You don't get a huge amount of time with any of the side characters here. You get just enough to give them a smidge of personality, but they're not on the page much, so it doesn't really matter. What I will say is we do have reoccurring characters here from books 1 and 2, specifically the romance partners from those books in Lachlan, Lark, Rowan and Sloane. And I'm happy to say that unlike in book 2, where Sloane and Rowan kind of overpowered the main couple when they were there, Fionn and Rose never feel like they're overpowered in this book when the other characters show up in terms of personality. Which is interesting because their personalities feel a lot more low-key in many regards and are less extreme, which is an interesting thing to think about. You do have a primary antagonist for the majority of this book as well. Again, we don't get a huge amount. We do get enough to make them a foil to our two main characters, in terms of them being abusive, in terms of people around them, quite manipulative, as well as potentially being someone who abused their position of authority in the past, and they're just a heinous person in general. But again, not a huge amount of kind of building there, but enough to make it work. But that fetches us to Rose and Fionn. And the first thing to touch on here is the chemistry of them as a couple, because they really do work in a way that the other characters in the previous books didn't. in that this actually does feel like a genuine falling in love. You don't have a rivals or an enemies to lovers thing going on here. These are two people that have been kind of thrown together, naturally are attracted to each other, and they build what feels like a legitimate relationship. And I really, really like that. They have a low-key chemistry rather than a bombastic one. You know, the thing in book one that really sold it to me was the chemistry between Rowan and Sloane. And book two, by the time it finally reached the end and Lachlan and Locke finally sorted out all their multitude of issues, that chemistry was off the charts. This lacks a lot of that energy, but it still kind of just worked in a really sweet way. And there's a lot of similarities between these two characters. These are characters that are running away from their past, but in very different ways. In Fionn's case, they've come to this tiny town in the middle of nowhere in Nebraska just to get away from people, and they're just going through the motions and filling their time rather than living. Whereas Lark is running away from their past choices, as they've left a bit of a trail of destruction wherever they've gone, enforcing their own personal sense of social justice, helping to protect abused women. And I really like the fact that these two have a very similar moral compass, but they approach it in a very, very different way. Especially when you look at the fact that you have Fionn, who is very controlled a lot of the time, doesn't overact on their emotions, whereas you have Rose, who is very impulsive. So when they see these things being done, whilst they don't act straight away, they very quickly decide to go and do something, and then end up making a bit of a mess. And these two characters, as a result, perfectly link together and just work. And as previously mentioned, I really like how low-key, organic, and actually genuine this relationship feels, which is what makes this book so different from the previous two. The world building is not extensive here, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it continues with a theme of this feeling like it's a lot more low-key than the previous two books felt as well. You have this small town rather than big sprawling metropolis like Boston, where everything just kind of happens. There's no massive disasters, there's no massive good days. It's just every day is another day, and it has its small peaks and troughs, but they don't feel like anything other than everyday changes. There's no major alterations to the status quo, which is why someone like Rose being in the town is a notable thing, because, you know, nothing ever really changes in this place, and you get the idea that everyone knows everybody else, and there's a little bit of like gossiping going on. You have these little quite quaint clubs which are like a centre for certain parts of the community. You have a fight club and you have a crochet club being the two main ones that are here. But even like the hospital feels quite just calm. It just feels like a calm place. You then kind of go over to the circus, and whilst that has these peaks of immense activity, and the sense of community is still there, and it really, really works quite well. Especially with the idea of it being, I call it sort of like the peeling paint idea of this probably shouldn't be working as well as it does, but the community that travels around together keeps it going. And you have an interesting parallel for the two main characters to work within there as where they're coming from. And it also helps to then ground the story really, really well, in that because everything feels relatively low stakes and low key, when things do happen, they really pop off the page in a way they kind of don't in the previous two books, because this isn't as busy. This feels like something a lot closer to a slice of life romance with a bit of murder in it, to be fair, but a lot closer to something a bit more humdrum and normal. And I kind of like it. Presentation then, not a huge amount to say about the cover. First of all, it fits thematically with the previous books. I think it's a decent cover. It has a lot more focus on Rose as a character, interestingly, on the main cover. Well, that's just a minor side point, but overall I really like it. I like the orange and yellows and the colour scheme as well. In terms of the writing, however, this feels a lot more slice of life than the other books did, if that makes sense. This feels a lot less high stakes and a lot more low key. So in that way, it's not as bombastic across the board as the previous two books were at times. And whilst you do have these peaks where things happen, it doesn't hit the same heights of excitement or chaos or chaotic energy that those books did. That's not, however, to say that it's bad, because it does fit the story that's being told about the relationship developing between Fionn and Rose in this book. Speaking of less bombastic, the spy scenes as well, again, lack some of the lustful energy, kind of, that they did in the previous two books, which, again, feels like a natural extension of the story that's going on, so I appreciate that as well. The minor criticism I do have with this is, because you have overlap with the previous two books, if you've left it a little bit of time between reading them, you might get a little bit lost in the timeline. I know I did on a few occasions, but that is more because it's been a while since I read Leather and Lag, and even longer since Butcher and Blackbird. So there's a few times where I got stuff slightly out of sequence and got mildly confused. But if you're reading them relatively close together, that will probably not be an issue. I also like the fact that the visiting characters from those books don't overpower the two leads of this one, which was an issue with Leather and Lag when Rowan and Sloane appeared in that one. And also, finally, the way that this does tie directly into the ending of Leather and Lag before kicking on to the final last act of this one is pretty well done as well. Overall, this is very solidly written. It has some good chemistry between the characters and some really good snappy dialogue as well. Final thoughts then. I enjoyed Scythe Sparrow quite a bit. I would say that I would probably say this is the best of the books objectively in terms of writing, organic character work, and storytelling. On the flip side, though, I enjoyed Butcher and Blackbird more. But all that being said, I gave this 4 stars out of 5. I think this is a good ending to the Ruinous Love Trilogy, and I enjoyed it a fair bit. And I think if you want a relatively sweet romance with a little bit of murder thrown in, you'll probably enjoy this quite a bit too. But that's my thoughts on Scythe and Sparrow by Brynne Weaver. Have you read this or any of the series? If you have, let me know in the comments below what you thought. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I'll catch you all very soon.